welcome to Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Sabrina Fernandes. Last month, the 2025 United Nations Climate Change Conference, better known as COP30, was held in the Amazonian city of Belém in northern Brazil. As with so many of the previous iterations of the COP process, the conference was widely seen as a disappointment, with a binding agreement for a roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels being blocked by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other oil-producing states, and the COP ended with no mention of fossil fuels in the closing texts. In the first part of today's episode, I spoke to economist and activist Sabrina Fernandes about her thoughts on COP30 and how the structure of the COP process could conceivably be reformed in order to stop recalcitrant states vetoing action on climate. We also talked about whether or not multi-lateral climate negotiations are being rendered irrelevant by developments in the global economy and the rapid expansion of renewable energy. We then went on to talk about Sabrina's recent article in The Breakdown titled Lula's Dilemma. We talked about the contradictory approach of Lula and the Brazilian Workers' Party towards climate and the environment, and what Sabrina sees as a failing politics of class conciliation that aims to bring agribusiness and mining interests on side with Lula's developmentalist agenda by granting them concessions that have disastrous environmental consequences. If you find this interview useful, then please consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content, such as the recent listener questions episodes with Richard Seymour. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/poletheoryother to sign up. Sabrina Fernandes is a Brazilian sociologist and political economist, and she is the head of research at the Alameda Institute. So Sabrina, we're speaking a couple of weeks after the conclusion of COP30, officially the 2025 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as the Conference of the Parties to the UN FCCC, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. COP30 was held in the city of Belém, the capital and largest city of the state of Pará in the north of Brazil, a city sometimes referred to as the gateway to the Amazon River. The conditions at the conference almost seemed to be designed to concentrate minds. Delegates reportedly faced dangerously high temperatures due to faulty air conditioning units. There was flooding inside the venue, and a major fire broke out in the African pavilion that had people running for the exits, and a number of delegates were treated for smoke inhalation. But in spite of hopes for an agreement that rose to the seriousness of the climate situation, the COP has been widely reported as being something of a disappointment. Somewhat incredibly, there was no mention of fossil fuels in the final conference text. Instead, we got this oblique reference to the UAE consensus, the name given to the COP28 deal, which had more explicit mention of fossil fuel phase-out. And although a tripling of adaptation finance was agreed, desperately needed now that some countries are spending up to a tenth of their budgets on dealing with floods and other consequences of climate change, that's well short of what's needed. Finally, when it comes to a so-called roadmap for a transition away from fossil fuels that many had hoped would be agreed at the COP, at best what we seem to have is this agreement for a roadmap to create a roadmap that will, for the time being, operate outside of the COP process, but that will report back to COP31 next year. So with all of that said, Sabrina, what's your take on the COP? What's your overall assessment of what was agreed? And do you think it's right to think of the conference as primarily yet another missed opportunity?
Well, Alex, I think there was a lot of hope for COP30, especially because the past COPs did not have that much of a presence from civil society. There wasn't a People Summit in the past years. So we knew that more people were looking at the COP system, people from different areas, not just the climate scientists or the general delegates, right? And the fact that there's this symbolism around the Amazon, it was quite important. Brazil is one of the climate villains because when we consider land use change and our emissions from agriculture, we are among the top 10 emitters. So the fact that Brazil was hosting COP30 in the Amazon and committing to fighting deforestation and also trying to bringing together different stakeholders this time, there was a lot of pressure. The people of Belém were actually quite excited about being able to welcome so many people. Well, we got to be honest that a lot of the contracting that happens for this type of mega events is just the same way that it happens for the Olympics, for the FIFA World Cup. Lots of private sector shenanigans happening along the way. So we knew it was going to be rhythm conflict, but I think the major disappointment that we have has to do with the setup for every COP, and that's not just COP30. The polluters are there, they keep getting invited in, and they're now present in record numbers. This happened now. We had the most amount of lobbies from agribusiness from any other COP, and the same thing for fossil fuels as well, right? So
And that is justified on the basis of inclusion, right?
exactly. So they say, well, we need to bring everyone in. This was actually the excuse coming from the COP30 presidency. We invited a lot of people from the private sector, but we also had record numbers of indigenous people attending. But I think I raised the question, what kind of inclusion is that when your opponent and the people who are actually driving the problem get not only access to the rooms, but they also have special access. So there's a thing called the host country guests. And among the host country guests, we had owners from mining companies, and we actually had the owners of JBS, which is the largest meat producer in the world. That's a Brazilian multinational right there. They're present in over 20 countries. They're present with subsidiaries in the US as well. And they get a red carpet extended to them. So that kind of inclusion where you just bring everyone to the table, but you don't have limits, you don't have criteria to say, well, you people from fossil fuels, you may be invited here, but you don't have a say. That's quite problematic. The system, the COP system, has turned into a trade show of sorts, and we gotta be honest that COP30 basically was seen as something that could finally save the Paris Agreement again. There's some readings that, well, it's not completely dead yet, but just the fact that it didn't it didn't get saved, I think that's one of the reasons why we should start rethinking this whole system. I'm not very hopeful for COP31.
Just regarding Brazil's role as host of COP30, it had been hoped by many that Marina Silva, Brazil's environment minister, would be made president of the COP talks this year. But instead, Lula appointed veteran foreign ministry diplomat Andre Correa Duagu. Can you say something on Duagu's role at the COP and the significance of his being appointed president instead of Silva, and to what extent the foreign ministry diverges from Silva and the environment ministry when it comes to climate policy? Apologies for butchering Brazilian names, by the way.
No, don't worry. So Brazil has a very strong diplomatic tradition. We take a lot of pride in it. It's a tradition of diplomacy for peace, for trying to find agreement where we cannot find agreement. But we also have to be honest that this tradition can lead into class conciliation. It can lead into politics where you just bring everybody to the table, but you're also stuck because you cannot move along. And I think the final days of COP30 really reflected that. There's a lot of competency coming from André do Lago coming in with an agenda that's called like the Mutirão agenda, which is about making things work collectively. But then Lula kind of got everybody by surprise, started talking about the roadmap away from fossil fuels, and they were not prepared to handle that at all. So they started putting a lot of energy into trying to get different delegations, different countries to at least subscribe to the idea of a roadmap or a schedule to discuss a roadmap. Things kind of got derailed along the process, but I think the choice to have André do Lago there rather than Marina Silva also has to do with how Marina Silva has positioned herself when it comes to Brazil's expansion of the fossil fuel frontier. There is a bit of a weird understanding, and this is mostly part of how this gets portrayed in the media, but also by the government, that Brazil is allowed to keep expanding fossil fuels because, well, at first, we did not emit as much from fossil fuels in the past. So we get to keep doing it. And like I said, conveniently hiding the fact that even when we don't consider land use change, when we consider just regular CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, we're among the top 10 emitters historically anyway. So there's one of the reasons why things have been manipulated in the media, but also in leftist circles in Brazil to justify oil expansion. And the other one is kind of bizarre as well, is that Brazil can keep drilling because we don't need as much fossil fuels at home. So we get to export it. And well, if those emissions, they're going to be accounted elsewhere. So we can be a climate leader even though we're still expanding fossil fuel production. Marina Silva was against that. So the past 2 years have been a big battle by Marina Silva and also our indigenous minister, Sonia Guajajara, trying to say that no, we cannot expand it, especially in the region where the government is planning on doing it, which is the equatorial margin, close to the mouth of the Amazon River. It's an area of great biodiversity, and we do have a very bad, concerning record of oil spills and other disasters.
And when it comes to trying to reform the COP process and to make it more effective, so in a recent article, you diagnosed two ways to try and reform the system. The first you describe as being a big and urgent push for UN FCCC reform, or alternatively, working outside of the COP process and creating treaties and agreements with states that actually want to pursue a phase out of fossil fuels. Because, as you also describe in that article, a big problem seems to be this emphasis on consensus, which grants a veto to any country that's participating. And in particular, Saudi Arabia played a big sort of blocking role at this year's COP. So, which of those two ways of reforming the process do you think is likely to be most productive in the current moment?
Well, UNFCCC reform should have happened at least 10 years ago. It should have been like one of the directives coming out of the Paris Agreement, to be quite honest. If this agreement is going to actually abide by the 1.5 threshold, we cannot have the denialists basically just obstructing the entire process. So when it came to this year during COP30, people were like, well, Trump is not sending the US delegation. We might have a chance, as if the US was our only problem. We know that's not the case at all. We are actually backtracking on things right now. So we have a problem where promises are made at each COP and then they become vaguer with time. And when they become very, very vague, you have an opportunity for governments to just announce some piecemeal policies and initiatives. They're just voluntary and we cannot actually keep track of them, and we cannot actually make sure that we enforce them, that they're actually going forward with them. So there's a tendency around these voluntary measures. The fact that the Brazilian COP presidency is saying that they will, like André do Lago said in the first person, I will create a roadmap. Well, we applaud that they're still trying, but it's actually quite disappointing. Should not be the effort by one person. Nobody's going to come and just save us all from this. We need collective efforts. So I actually wonder if UNFCCC reform is still possible, but I would take anything right now because it's still kind of better late than never. We're still at that point. So as at least if we could secure consensus, was understood not as unanimity, but actually a two-thirds majority, we could actually advance a little bit on that. And but I would go even further than that. We need to kick out this system where the private sector has such a big observer role. I don't understand why we still have the pavilions with all of these panels and the little presentations and the displays and all of those things. Is all very shiny. This year they had things with lots of lights. No wonder that the electricity system of the COP could not support that and all of the AC at the same time. So it's all very shiny. I think we should take that away and we should focus on the negotiations and an assemblies format where civil society members organize can actually give feedback back to the delegates. This would be like a two-part system, and that would restructure everything around blue zone, green zone, and things like that. I don't know if anybody is actually willing. When I say anybody here, I'm talking about a party, right? One of the states, one of the countries, there are signatories to the convention. I don't know if any of them are actually willing to push that forward. We know that Colombia, at the end of the final plenary, the delegate Daniela, she just came right out and said it, that, well, a consensus built on climate denialism is a catastrophe. But we don't know if Colombia has the multilateral power to actually push for UNFCCC reform. And considering that that doesn't seem to be on the cards for Australia and Turkey, and for COP31 in Antalya in Turkey next year, I think we're still kind of just around the wishful thinking area when it comes to this. But where we find some more concrete measures is this initiative behind the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It builds on historical lessons around nuclear non-proliferation, trying to get other people to the table to negotiate. This is a civil society initiative that's become embraced through a lot of hard work by the people in the initiative by some states. So Colombia is one of the leaders there, but we have a lot of Pacific islands. We're talking about Vanuatu, Tuvalu, states that are on the verge of disappearing. So that's the ultimate loss of sovereignty. That's the threat that Tuvalu and Vanuatu are facing. Cambodia just joined. So we are gathering more support. And the idea for this conference in April is to start something more concrete with the people from civil society and from the states that actually want to make this thing happen. Because what we find in the COP system is that the problem is not just the fact that we have some denialists in the room, is that the very basis of the negotiations allows for climate denialism. We're still upholding net zero. The Paris Agreement opened up the room for carbon markets. So this is not something that's being imposed from outside the system by Saudi Arabia or other oil producers. This is already part of the convention. So maybe we need to start with something else and then build some pressure from outside. And so because of it, because of this other agreement, the convention will have to be put into a different type of track.
Because of the lack of progress that's being made at COP each year, we're increasingly seeing this argument being made that COP and just multilateral negotiations in general are being sidelined by positive developments in the global economy. So, for instance, Fiona Harvey, an environment editor at The Guardian, recently wrote that outside the windowless negotiating rooms of the sclerotic UN process, the real world is moving fast. Renewable power surpassed coal this year, and investment in clean energy at $2 trillion a year is now double that going into fossil fuels, according to the International Energy Agency. More than half of China's power generation capacity is now low carbon, and half of its new cars are electric. India has met its renewable targets 5 years early. Solar panels this year became Pakistan's largest source, and at last Africa, with the world's biggest capacity for solar generation, but long overlooked when it came to investment, is seeing a surge. For many, it is this progress in the real economy, rather than the negotiations, that is now the major source of hope. What do you make of that kind of argument and the idea that the COP process and multilateral negotiations are simply being superseded by positive developments in the global economy and the increasing rollout of renewable energy and infrastructure?
I understand the urge to look at the glass as half full. It's kind of important so we're not just doing these eulogies and getting disappointed every year. But if I'm going to look for the glasses half full, I would like to look somewhere else and not necessarily with what's being called the green economy. Because a lot of things are changing, but they're not necessarily transitioning, right? So we're talking about changing the way we look at automobiles. So if automobiles are a source of emissions because of combustion engines, we change their engines into electric vehicles. I'm not saying that they're not important, that we don't need electric vehicle technologies and that EVs can help us along the process. But if we're approaching transportation without a transversal look, without looking to where the minerals are coming from, and the fact that we're still piling people into these gigantic urban settings where we're creating other types of waste, we're not actually tackling the root of the problem. So just the fact that a lot of the patents and a lot of the technologies involved into electric mobility are focused on individual mobility and not public mobility, that shows us that we need a stronger hand, that we need some guidance, that we need the state to change the way it's behaving around it, and we need more popular support and input around it to make sure that we're changing more things as society at the same time to push us towards transition. The matter of fact right now is that a lot of the green growth economy is based on the expansion of sacrifice zones. So we are sacrificing biomes, ecosystems in other parts of the world, usually poorer parts or parts where we find indigenous territories and local communities that are treated as these, frontline communities. And we can just negotiate with them, or we can maybe compensate them financially, but we need to take all of the resources we can get. This approach is the approach we criticize as this carbon tunnel vision, where we're talking about decarbonizing things and not actually changing the way we approach nature and the way we produce in relation to nature. And I think one of the things that we need to consider is that the COP system is also failing because it's not taking planetary boundaries into account. It's looking at emissions as units of emissions, mostly as CO2, ignoring other types of emissions. There's been a little bit of progress around methane, for example, but it is still very much on the margins. And because of it, it's very simple for you to just promote some specific changes. There are usually technological changes and not necessarily systemic changes. And I think we need to move into systemic changes. Just to make a last point on this, at the same time that we're seeing a different in parameters, for example, renewables over like passing coal in terms of production and consumption, a lot of the oil companies, fossil fuel companies, that in the past years started rebranding themselves as energy companies, saying, no, Total Energies is one example of this. But even Petrobras, our national oil company in Brazil, talking about, oh, we're advancing renewables, we need to invest, we're becoming energy companies. Well, they realize that in the past 3 years, they're not really being forced to go into that direction. It might be interesting from the standpoint of diversifying your portfolio, making sure that you're investing in other types of energy sources as well. But they're all going back to focusing on fossil fuels, and that's an impact of Trump's drill baby drill. But that's also an impact of the way that we just gave them too much room. We're still giving them a free pass because we don't dare even mention the words fossil fuels in our agreements. So I'm actually looking at things more at the glass half empty when it comes to the green economy. The supposed decoupling of economic growth and the use of resources, that can be questioned, especially when we're looking at the global south, where they're creating these sacrifice zones, and the fact that nobody actually wants to talk about putting a cap on our global energy usage, for example, so we can actually adjust things and say that in some places we need to bring it down so other places can bring it back up. So this adjustment at the global level is still pretty much missing from the conversation.
So let's chat a bit about your recent article in The Breakdown that was titled Lula's Dilemma, which is on the question of how to make sense of the Lula administration's approach to climate policy. And you describe how there was, for anyone concerned about Brazil or indeed the world, given the importance of the Amazon to a stable climate, tremendous relief when Jair Bolsonaro lost power and was replaced as president by Lula in 2022. The Bolsonaro administration was, of course, not merely negligent when it came to the climate and the environment, but as you describe in the article, the administration enthusiastically supported the deliberate use of arson by agribusiness interests to enable land grabs and to further the exploitation of the Amazon, and even went as far as to celebrate Brazilian skies turning black with smoke from forest fires. And the administration, again, as you describe, also openly and unapologetically used violence against indigenous peoples in order to ensure that agribusiness could function unimpeded. But you go on to write that the idea that we would simply return to the contradictory land and environmental policies of previous PT governments, including under Lula himself, was hardly an enticing prospect. And as a sort of emblematic example of the contradictions of Lula's policies, or the PT in general, you refer to the controversial giant dam, Belo Monte, on the northern section of the Xingu River in the northern state of Pará, the fifth largest dam in the world that was constructed between 2011 and 2016 during Dilma Rousseff's time in office. Now, Rousseff, like Lula, is of course a member of the Brazilian Workers' Party, the PT, and she succeeded Lula after his second term in office ended in 2011. And you write in the article that Belo Monte provides a compelling metaphor for a tension that has long haunted Lula: the need to reconcile socio-environmental concerns with his and his party's focus on a particular brand of development. Could you expand on that and explain how you think Belo Monte helps to illustrate those tensions and contradictions in the environmental and climate policies of Lula and the PT?
I think this is relevant actually not just for Brazil. It's a matter for Global South and every other country where we talk about the need to develop, where we talk about us being underdeveloped or being developing nations. And the idea that if we're developing nations, what are we developing towards, right? So, what is the end goal? What is our horizon here? We already have an understanding, and this comes from even Marxist dependency theory discussions, that we cannot just emulate the development of the countries in the global north. This is not possible because of our class structure. We have a working class that's overexploited, a working class that's in the international division of labor is actually not producing things that have a lot of value added. So that also brings our income down. So there's one of the matters. But the other matter is that our infrastructure is built around use of land and extractivism. And this use of land of extractivism gave rise to a specific type of dominant class in Brazil and most of Latin America as well, which is the region that I study the most. And we find that there's this tendency to look at them as if they were just large landowners. They were just, doing their own little thing over there, when in fact this capital is actually quite coordinated. They talk to each other and they influence a lot of projects, especially projects that they can call development projects, because these development projects can be justified as being for the good of the nation or attending to specific needs. So, for example, we need energy security. We don't want to have blackouts, and we want our electricity to not be based on fossil fuels, for example. So why not build a major hydropower dam? The idea to build everything through mega projects is part of this Promethean vision of everything that comes from large landowning classes. That type of mentality informed how we think about development in Brazil. It's about major infrastructure projects, lots of money coming in from the government, lots of fiscal incentives, partnerships with the private sector. And in the end, we forget that other little thing, that if we're going to do things without restraining ourselves and planning properly and looking to the actual needs of people and not necessarily the needs of extractivist and other damning types of sectors, if we're just going to follow this specific path, we're going to promote even more destruction, and we're the ones who are going to bear the cost of it. And Belo Monte is an example of this, because how hypocritical it is to say we're protecting the Amazon and we care about the rivers and the biodiversity, and we know that this matters for Brazilians, it matters for Latin Americans, but also everybody on the planet, because we're talking about this interconnection between the ecosystems. We're going to do that, but we might also build something that's going to kill most of the river. And if it kills most of the river, there's going to be consequences for the indigenous communities around there who are responsible for taking care of the forest. Because when they're not taking care of the forest, there's more land grabbing happening and more deforestation happening. We seem to ignore this cascading effect from these mega projects when we're talking about development. And this particular brand of development is what we call developmentalism, which is basically development for the sake of development without really thinking through the basis of it, the values of it, and what kind of other projects and initiatives we could have that could actually raise up the standard of living for people in our society in ways that where we don't think of nature as an obstacle. but actually a way to cooperate with nature, regulate better with nature's metabolism.
And could you say a bit more about the role of Lula and also the PT historically? Because in that article, you describe Lula as a firm believer in class conciliation, the idea that if national elites are allowed to make enough money, they will support Brazilian growth as well as the redistributive policies that are a key element of the PT's popular democratic program. Because it might seem rather naive, a seemingly savvy politician like Lula would believe he could win over agribusiness and mining interests to his side through that kind of class compromise.
Yes, Lula's politics are what we call moderate left politics. There are some political scientists that might claim that is even more akin to something like a center right kind of politics. But because there is a strong leftist base and a strong workers' orientation, and also towards fighting poverty, I still put Lula's politics on the left. But understanding this, it is a type of leftism that, quite a peculiar way in the global south, seems to think that our national capitalist class is nationalist and actually cares about the good of the nation, and by caring for the good of the nation cares for the people in the nation. We are a country where we are fighting very hard right now. That's been a battle over the past year to actually reduce our working hours, because we work 6 days a week, most of the people in the country. So if people are working 6 days a week and the capitalist class does not want to reduce it to even a 5 day working week, we know they don't care for the people themselves. Yet, even though the government knows that and the government has embraced the battle to reduce the working week, the government also believes, and this is part of the tradition of the hegemonic wing of the Workers' Party, to think that other things we're able to reconcile. We can find agreement. As long as we listen to everyone, and we're going to have social participation schemes, and we're going to be consulting with civil society, and we're going to have open doors for some social movements, but we're also going to be talking directly to the billionaires and telling them, well, maybe we'll tax you a little bit, which is something that Lula wants to do. And we actually are happy that he embraced this battle. But we tax you a little bit, but we don't actually do anything about the inequality of property, which is a huge issue. So it is a government and a party oriented towards fighting poverty, fighting income inequality. So there's the matter of tax justice right now, really looking forward into what the government is proposing around tax exemptions for the poorest working class, things like that, taxing the super rich. That's great. But our wealth inequality is the worst in the entire planet. We're actually tied with Russia. Our Gini index for wealth inequality is 0.82, which is incredible. And one of the reasons for that is that the dominant class in Brazil is able to concentrate a lot of wealth because nobody ever touches their property. What we've been talking about for decades around agrarian reform moves so slowly in Brazil, very slowly, and the indigenous territories as well. So this issue around land and what we do with the land is really important, and it should matter to other parts of the world, because when we're talking, for example, that the largest meat producer is JBS, is a Brazilian company, it means that the meat that's being consumed in Europe, in China, in the US, that's coming from Brazil exports, it's meat drenched in indigenous blood. We should take that into account. It's meat that's coming from this deforestation as well. And we need to connect this type of struggle so we don't think that, oh, that's something that's just happening in another country. Economically, we're all tied in this situation. So the way that Lula approaches the capitalist class in Brazil also matters, not just to environmental concerns in other parts of the world, but how much this capital is involved. I mean, JBS actually contributed to Trump's inauguration. So there are like so many connections here that are not just global south or about what's happening on the periphery. That's also happening like at the core of capitalism, because these multinational corporations are actually really, really big corporations.
The fact that this policy of, as you describe, class conciliation continues. I mean, it seems particularly extraordinary now, right? Because you could sort of imagine that in the early 2000s, maybe this might have seemed more plausible. But given where we are, given that agribusiness and mining interests haven't just supported the right of the Brazilian political spectrum, they backed a coup against Dilma Rousseff, they supported the jailing of Lula on corruption charges, and gave their support to a proto-fascist like Jair Bolsonaro. So you would sort of think that at this moment in time that the policy of class compromise had been pretty much tested to destruction, and yet it still continues. I mean, how do you make sense of that at this point in time?
There's a weird frame that we bring back from time to time because it's always unforgettable that right after the coup against Dilma Rousseff and we're trying to reorganize ourselves, Lula had not been arrested yet, and he was speaking to a crowd of like many people here in São Paulo, and he was actually quite resentful of the agribusiness class, of the bankers, saying that they made so much money under my governments.
Yeah.
And
Why
he
aren't they
was almost
grateful?
like, exactly, he was like calling them out, you're so ungrateful. I let you make so much money. So it shows us that in the end there is working class politics in this government, but there's no politics for class struggle. And that was actually missing from the conversation, from their calculations here. This is a matter of a struggle for power. So you cannot just ask for the capitalist class to play nice all of the time. They played nice while they were making a lot of money. As soon as the pie began to shrink, as we hit a little bit of a crisis, well, they don't want to give up what they already won in the past, right? So they want to make sure they keep winning. And if the Workers' Party had limits on this because, well, you're not just going to take away from the poorest of society, well, they can orchestrate a coup and make sure they can advance with the most horrible types of austerity politics and actually all types of grabbing of resources, which is what happened under Bolsonaro. But if you think of it, Alex, Lula still hasn't managed to fight the austerity politics that he inherited from the past. His entire approach to it has been to find other sources of funds to make sure that his social policies, which we very much appreciate, can be funded. But so he's going to do that going through tax reform, for example. But he's still giving a lot of fiscal incentives to mining businesses, a lot of fiscal incentives to agribusiness, and he's not really daring to question this spending ceiling that was imposed on us during the coup. That, for me, we thought that the first year of his government, his third mandate, would have been all about getting people together and calling people to the streets to say, we need to get rid of this ceiling. This policy of austerity is strangling us and is going to actually strangle my alternatives, my possibilities to bring you what I promised. So it's almost like self-sabotage in a way as well.
Well, plenty of it about on the social democratic or centre left of the political spectrum. Do you think that if Lula were to pursue a more confrontational approach vis-a-vis capital and agribusiness and mining, do you think that that would necessitate the prior nurturing of different economic sectors and a diversification of Brazil's economy? Because presumably, as long as the economy is so dominated by those interests, and as long as the Brazilian economy remains relatively lower down on the value chain, then surely those interests are just going to continue to have the whip hand over any Brazilian administration, regardless of their intentions. And because, as you describe in the case of the PT, they need economic growth in order to fund their redistributive policies, right? So is, really quite radical economic turn needed to just change the very nature of the Brazilian economy?
Yes, that's why I don't think it's just a matter of just waking up the next day and issuing a decree of agrarian reform or something like that, because agrarian reform is actually already predicted in our constitution. So there's a lot of leeway. Like he could do this. He could go ahead and he would get into a fight with Congress because our Congress is very far right. They actually just canceled the majority of his vetoes on this really terrible bill that dismantled environmental licensing.
This is the devastation bill, right?
That's what we named it. Yes, yeah. So it is a bill to update environmental licensing, but it's actually about dismantling it. And one of the major things is that for specific types of projects, the corporations will be able to just basically sign a form and say, no, we're going to abide by legislation, and that's all. So it's like self-licensing, and it's really absurd. So we have been fighting this the whole year. We wanted Lula to veto every single point of this bill. He vetoed only specific portions of it. And Congress just this week, they just waited for COP30 to end. And, there were just a couple of weeks back, all of these parliamentarians talking about the planet and planting trees and things like that. And now they're just supporting the dismantling of environmental licensing. And Lula could use this as an opportunity to actually call people to the streets. We're missing that element of mobilization. And even if he doesn't feel like he can do that by himself, using his voice, there are ministers who could be doing this. And also there are parties, there are central unions, but we have an issue of very low mobilization in Brazilian society. This tendency to think that people got elected, so they're going to do the job, and we just complain or online or something like that. So demobilization, it is a bit of a mental state, but it's also a project. It is also a consequence of the first mandates of the Workers' Party. When we took to the streets, we started hearing that, wow, this is no good. You're going to bring down the government, and then the right wing is going to win the next elections, or the government is going to get impeached. And now we're living under this shadow, this very dark cloud of Bolsonaro and the coup against Dilma, that if we do anything to remotely criticize the government for being weak on certain matters, we hear people telling us, you can do this. You're actually, driving the population right into the far right's arms. You're actually helping to dismantle the good things that the government has done so far. So demobilization is a strong set of ideology from the institutional left as well, which is something that worries us a lot. And looking to this current situation, there are a lot of things that happen behind doors. So we're not even aware of some of the battles that Lula is fighting, the things that he's giving up in order to secure other things as we fight with this conservative Congress right now. So things are very much kept in the dark sometimes. And we hear that Lula knows best.
Yeah.
And this is actually not a good practice for democracy, I think.
Yeah, father knows what he's doing kind of vibe. Yeah, not great. Regarding the still very conservative Congress that you mentioned there, in the article you talk about the agro parliamentary group, which represents the interests of big landowners and is partly comprised of landowners themselves, whilst being representatives. And you mention how the agro parliamentary group is well connected to the far right and to right wing paramilitary forces, including the ultra conservative Harpia Institute and its allied zero invasion paramilitary movement. Could you talk a bit about those links and about what the Harpia Institute and the Zero Invasion Force are about and what they've been doing?
One thing worth highlighting is that Lula got elected in a scenario of heavy militarism of Brazilian thinking. So this was Bolsonaro's doing. We have more guns in Brazilian society now. We have more
Yeah.
gun clubs in Brazilian society now. And this is also very beneficial to these paramilitary groups or these conservative thinkers that are just saying, well, let's put some guns in the hands of people. They say it in the name of public safety, security, fighting drug traffickers, and so on. The same stuff that we hear coming from the failed war on drugs type of frame. And because of this gun alliance, what we have is that in Congress, you have the agro parliamentary front that's very connected to the conservative, evangelical, Christian, biblical front that's very connected to the gun lobby. So they work together. The funding sources are alike, and the type of legislation that they want to promote is not disconnected at all. We actually have some really bizarre cases of evangelical churches in Brazil going with people out into the woods to train them as if they had guns, things like that. Some really
Yeah.
strange things happening around then. And we know that with the Harpy Institute and with the Zero Evasion movement, there are parliamentarian connections as well. And some of the people involved in the movement, they are large landowners. A lot of what they do is direct intimidation of indigenous communities and rural workers. But we also have cases more connected to taking back the land. So that means that they invaded indigenous territory. The indigenous community goes and secures the territory again. And then the movement, this zero invasion movement, starts to organize to take it back from indigenous communities again. And they go heavily armed. And we had a situation in the state of Bahia last year that has a very lethal police force, of the police force basically just watching a massacre happen, supporting the actions of the zero invasion movement. So they get to do a lot of things because they know they are above the law. They're not getting prosecuted, they're not getting arrested, and they have support from a section of society that has become very much like believers in guns,
Yeah.
which is not that much of a tradition in Brazil when I was born 30 years ago. And then when Bolsonaro comes with the far right, the gun becomes not only a symbol for sexist politics, like being a true man. So this type of misogyny is also a part of it, but it's also a symbol of how the true landowner should defend their property. So you defend your property not just from somebody trying to steal from you, but you also defend the property that you're expanding, and you directly pinpoint indigenous communities, former enslaved communities, so quilombola communities, other people who live off the land as your enemies. And currently, there's not a lot being done when it comes to legislation or to protection coming from the federal government to actually tackle this. The fact that there are areas in the country where we're hearing rumors now of collective suicide by indigenous leaders in certain communities because of so much harassment. They can't take it anymore. So we're not living the type of indigenous distress that we lived under Bolsonaro just a few years back. But we cannot claim that just because we have an indigenous ministry, that we're advancing with some of the indigenous land settlements that are necessary, that we're actually providing the resources for indigenous sovereignty, which I think is a huge issue here. We talk a lot, we love to talk about sovereignty in Brazil, Brazilian sovereignty, national sovereignty, but we always recognize it in a sense of having the rights to use all of our resources and empowered through the state and aiming at economic growth. And this formula is just not working. This formula is leading to other forms of ecocide as well.
Towards the end of your article, you write that if freed from the imperatives of major industry and the government's flawed green developmentalism, it may finally be possible to foster just economic practices that acknowledge planetary limits and value environmental well-being. In concrete terms, this would mean agrarian reform, indigenous reparations, and strengthened environmental protections, all in order to achieve a green transformation, including on energy, that Lula's government has often spoken of in recent years. So finally, how likely do you think such a transformation in Brazil is in the coming years and decades? And do you see the reforms you describe as being ones that would have to be imposed on the Lula government from without? Or do you see fractions of the PT that would gladly get on board with such an agenda?
I don't see that much of a left alternative rising in Brazil right now, something that would be more radical and actually helping us either push the moderate left in a more radical direction or to replace it. This is definitely not in the cards, especially because we're living this post-traumatic disorder from Bolsonaro. And like they're so afraid that if his people come back to the executive government, that things could go along into big disaster. That's why I think that, for example, next year we have elections in Brazil. A lot of the focus should be on unseating some of these right-wing legislators, targeting them, making sure that people know the type of violence that they espouse, what they're involved in, the level of corruption around it. But we also need this institutional left to stop investing in the things that do us harm. And one of the ways to do that is we have to directly divest from agribusiness. That means not stop subsidizing agribusiness the way that we do it, stop giving them so many fiscal incentives and lines of credits and things like that, and use that money that we save by not propelling them to propel the alternative, to propel agroecological movements, and to help to restructure food production in Brazil in other ways that are not directly connected to deforestation and are not for big exports. One of the reasons that we're actually failing to assert this type of Brazilian sovereignty that we talk about, that we dream about, is that even when we go and we confront Trump about his tariffs or something like that, it's because we're worried that agribusiness is going to lose markets. So how can we talk about green industrialization in the country where a lot of what we do is still being dictated by the same capitalist class from before? I mean, Lula was talking about a roadmap to transition from fossil fuels, which is good, but not any roadmap will do. It has to be an actual roadmap that abides by planetary boundaries, that considers the carbon budget, so we don't just keep giving new types of permits to drill, which might be a dream because that's what the carbon market does. It issues permits to emit. So we can do that. And the proof that we need to give substance to this is the fact that just as soon as COP30 ended, Lula actually allowed for coal plants to stay in Brazil for longer. So now the plan is to have coal plants until 2040 in the country. So there's just a few days afterwards. And when we look into who owns one of these coal plants, is JBS, is the largest meat producer in the world. So this capital is completely entrenched into other areas, you know? So agribusiness capital is also finance capital, is also energy capital. And we need to ensure that we have a more of a transversal type of politics here. And I think one of the directions that we could push the current institutional left, if they're not going to become radical the way that we need them to, at least they could help us by reorganizing the budget. You know, let's spend money on the things that we actually want to advance, on the things that we actually want to promote. And if we want to be not so dependent on the power of agribusiness, then we might as well stop funding it. That could be one of the ways to approach it. And I hope we can push forward next year when we're campaigning during the next elections.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/poltheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.